expansion of the individuals and the institutions that were involved. Our participants in the study were deeply embedded in a world that could not contain their suffering. Their world gave them support, chemo, surgery, radiation, love, flowers, and lots of beautiful things, but they needed something that was not available to them in their ordinary world or in their ordinary reality. And so we gave them access to various versions of psychedelic shamanism that we call psychedelic therapy. And through this process, their world expanded and their consciousness expanded. We had 3 preparatory sessions before their medicine session, and these were crucial in building a shared worldview so that both in the conscious and the unconscious level, we shared a narrative of the nature of their illness, the way of understanding their world, and also what their relationship to the psilocybin was, how they saw it, whether they saw it as an agent that was coming to heal them, or a transporting process to another realm, or something that they didn't really even put into language. But it became an object of transference in which their expectations of it deeply created the experience that they had. So the therapist's confidence and belief in the process was central to the success. And I believe that that the medicine would bring about a beneficial expansion of their sense of self, and our belief that it would happen, our confidence in it, I think created significantly to the fact that it actually occurred. So there was a narration and repair and reconstruction of life meaning. So in our psychedelic therapy training, we gave meaning in life, pride of place, as a central organizing principle. Existential distress due to cancer brings about a loss of meaning in life and a sense that one's life is over or meaningless and that it has ended in certain ways. I am certainly a smaller person and my life has an impoverished meaning. And I see this as part of the humanist tradition that we brought to our patients. But so many people showed up in spirit form: parents, children, spouses, animals, dreams, and hopes. So in so many ways, these felt similar to me, or seemed to be parallels of the way that spirit would show up and weave a new story that is more in balance for the individual and the individual's relationship to community. And this is exactly what our meaning-making approach did, helping our participants find a new story for their lives and a new narrative that was built up out of the thoughts and perceptions and emotions that occurred while they were in an intoxicated and dissociated state. Next is the sense of the divine other. What was the divine other in our study? The mushroom for most people. As I mentioned earlier, many people insisted upon calling the psilocybin the mushroom, even though we explained that it was industrial grade psilocybin that was made in a plant and not by a plant. But they didn't care. They didn't care. In shamanic culture, the shaman calls on the divine other, and the belief that there is a divine other that will come and bring relief is central. And we encourage the patients or the participants to believe this. We tell the suffering person, they tell the suffering person, you are not alone. All this help is here for you, and the medicine and intoxication gives you access to it. Our mythology, this pill, this room, these therapists, this event, this study will bring you something otherworldly and profound and transformative to you. Ancestors, memories, music, dream stories, all these became the divine others that came to help the people in our study and bring help from a new place and in some ways a magic place. The lost self retrieved and poison removed. So many of the people in our study felt that they had lost something of themselves. And in fact, they had lost all of themselves that they remembered and that they liked, and became nothing more than a cancer diagnosis and a chemo regimen and a set of blood markers. And in session, they would retrieve these lost parts of themselves: friends, hobbies, exercise, dreams, energy, hope, love, and the will to live. All of these came in a spirit sense to return to these people, and it was really miraculous to watch, not just during the session, but during the weeks that followed, as they would come and tell us how inspired and how spirit had returned to their lives. They felt possessed by cancer, and the therapy sessions help them extract and eject the possession. Last, self-other boundaries were reimagined. As I'm sure all of you know, we heard connection, connection, connection from people talking about their connection to themselves, to their families, to nature, to the earth, to the hope, to death, to the future, and to a sense of oneness. And this sense of reconnection to the world, you would hear it in session after session. And I don't believe that you would hear this and have this vivid experience were it not for the intensity that intoxication and dissociation brought to the people in our study. So to wrap up, what is the take-home for tonight? Well, I think we need to find a way to bring intoxication and dissociation to a more balanced place in Western psychiatry and psychology and psychoanalysis, and seeing them as potentially therapeutic and not inherently destructive. But on a larger scale, I think we all need to be part of the answer to my question, what is psychedelic therapy? I think as clinicians we need to write papers and hold case conferences about psychedelic therapy, and these need to be integrated with each of our own clinical worldviews. And I would hope that colleagues who are not believers will come to these conferences and read these papers and be moved and be made curious. I think we need to write and speak about psychedelic ways of healing and intervening into unseen realms, but all of this within our own vernacular of our lives and our identities as psychotherapists. So I think that emerged for me in preparing for tonight's talk. One of the strongest lessons had to do with the incredibly strong, vibrant, central nature of the mind of the shaman and his or her worldview in the process of shamanic healing. You know, when I hear people say they don't want to be a strong presence in the room or they want to hold back and let the medicine do the work, it raises some anxiety for me because I don't think that we're actually capable of doing that. And this certainly doesn't mean I'm encouraging talking a lot, but understanding who you are and what you bring as a human being and as a therapist and integrating that with your practice, I think is such an important thing for each of us to be doing and writing papers and having conferences and talking about it. We need to take a lesson from this, believing in what we know and in what we do, but also being deeply receptive to the vastness of what we don't already know. So I think we probably have a long way to go for psychedelic therapy to be well accepted into mainstream psychiatry and psychology. And I'm well aware that many people here may not think that that's such a great place for psychedelic therapy to be happening. But, and I do believe that there are many venues where psychedelic healing takes place. But I hope that we can continue to be strong advocates for this within our culture of being therapists in more traditional settings as well as the most alternative ones. And so with that, I want to thank you. So I think we're going to have questions next. Everything's understood. Yeah.
How much control or choice does a person have in music or tactile touch or in the setting? Was that clinically controlled, or were they allowed to say, no Mozart for me?
Well, the soundtrack was constructed before we began the study. And so theoretically, everybody heard the exact same music all the way through. However, if somebody asked for it to be turned down, we said yes. So they didn't have to listen to the music, but they couldn't bring their own music. And they listened to what we chose. We felt that it was a confounding variable to have different people listening to different music. And there also was a kind of technique in which we encouraged the person, if they didn't like the music, to have a kind of meditative, observational attitude toward it. If you don't like it, then fully be with not liking it and lean into what you hate about it or lean into how it's disturbing you, rather than discriminating. I like this, I don't like this, this feels good, this doesn't feel good, and I want to get away from it, which is consistent with the basic instruction of leaning into difficult, terrifying, frightening, sad emotions. We did have one person who asked for the playlist ahead of time, which we gave it to her, and she said, well, if that's the playlist, I'm not coming. And unfortunately, we weren't able to accommodate what she wanted, but she came anyway. And so I said, we're going to play it, and if you don't like it, we'll turn it way down. And that's what we did. Yeah.
What happened?
She didn't like it. Well, she knew she didn't like it. Yeah. It was a great experience. It was an amazing, amazing experience. It was the first person that I worked with who taught me that 4 or 5 hours of panic anxiety is not an uncreative experience for her, because she had a profound effect, and it had to do with facing her anxiety. She had a chronic anxiety problem, and being with it in her psychedelic process taught her so much about it and led to a great deal of reduction in her anxiety afterwards. It also was the first person that I intervened with pretty actively in terms of holding her, in which she went from being panicky to crying. And I think that moving from panic to tears shifted something really profound for her. But she never liked the music. I think that we're going to be choosing people with the mic.
Oh, I wanted to say thank you, and I really love the title of your talk, and I wanted you to speak a bit more about how you're pairing different compounds with different disorders.
Well, in our study, we only had one compound. All of the research that's happening at NYU is with psilocybin, so there's not a connection with it.
Well, across the board, like I know MAPS has a number of different studies, and they're pairing, say, MDMA with PTSD or psilocybin with end-of-life issues, and this idea is a really interesting one about psychedelic therapy in general being a good treatment, but there is this idea of like, well, what are you treating and why? And it is a treatment in search of a disorder, and I was just wondering if you could talk a bit more about that.
Well, it really depends on who's doing the asking and why the diagnosing is happening. I think for research purposes, we need to have diagnosable disorders that we're treating that have symptoms that we can measure. I know that there's some controversy, not controversy, but difference of opinion about using MDMA for PTSD versus psilocybin for PTSD. And some people believe that the panic and the access to flashbacks could be made worse by psilocybin, and yet I think that there's some psilocybin PTSD research that's getting underway. I don't think that we have a rational basis for pairing disorders with certain compounds. I think that they're evolved through culture and through emotional beliefs. I certainly think with ibogaine and addiction, there is biological basis for using it with opiates, but I wouldn't say that we have a real rational basis for saying ibogaine versus ayahuasca for addiction. And at NYU, we're doing a psilocybin and addiction study. The idea that a meaningful exploration of the role of alcohol in your life, the role of drunk and intoxication experiences, the process of addiction, looking at that in a psychedelic state is therapeutic and helpful. I think it could happen with LSD as well as psilocybin. There's a proposal for some LSD research at NYU, and this got the ultra nix from our department because it just seemed too frightening. So it was not made on a rational basis at all. It was like, not in my house.
Yes, I wanted to ask, don't you think in terms of the therapist's presence in the room that it would be important that the therapist have done their own psychedelic or entheogenic journeying and studying and working, which would be very much in line with the shamanic model,
Yes,
right?
I
And
do.
how do you address that?
Yes, I do.
How do you address that with training? people?
Well, it's something which we're still in the process, we're evolving toward that. The idea of therapists taking psilocybin or taking entheogens as part of their training raises all kinds of anxiety for repetition of the 60s, where there was a loss of boundaries between the therapist and the patient, and various kinds of excesses came about. This, I think, is probably going to lag behind the treatment of the ill individual, because we really don't have a model in psychiatry for the direct experience of the suffering of the other person, except in psychoanalysis, where in order to become an analyst, you have to have a meaningful personal psychoanalysis where you not only come with suffering, but enter into a deep, genuine relationship with your analyst and are healed or improved by it. And it's the only way that you really know the experience and know the terrain. So this is something which is lacking in our current training procedures. Not everybody agrees with you. You know, some of my colleagues say, you know, I've seen people who are just terrific psychedelic therapists who have never had a psychedelic experience. And I think people enter the spirit world, enter into alternative states of consciousness, and can have very profound, transformative, dissociative intoxication experiences without taking anything. I think that I'm not going to say, no, that can't happen, and you know, you must do it this way. But certainly I think in the big picture of training, it's important.
Hi, I'm over here. I'm wondering, beyond the current constraints that are happening in the research that requires the clinician to just act as a passive sitter, in your imagination, like, what is the ideal role of a psychedelic therapist? What would that look like in 10, 20 years?
Well, we're not really required to be passive sitters. And I think that what we're, well, let me start again. Preparing the patient or preparing the participant before the sessions, I think, is the central part of creating a relationship and creating an expectation, developing trust, and developing deep understanding. Then being present with the medicine, whatever form that takes, and afterwards integrating what happened. And I think that the therapist can have a very profound role in making meaning of the psychedelic experience, helping the person integrate it into their life. So it's really before and after that I think the greater activity in terms of understanding and intervening that I think it needs to happen, not so much during the session itself.
Hi, thank you for
Hi.
your incredible talk. I have a question. I want to come back to something that you said a minute ago about the role of touch in the active session. Does it ever happen that people want you to hold their hand or to hug them or to, if they want to cuddle up with you? And what do you do with that?
We offer people, we ask them at the beginning if they're comfortable being touched. And if they're not, we don't touch them. But every person that I've asked has said yes, that they're comfortable with that. And to answer your question, yes, yes, and no. So we do have hand holding, and there is a certain amount of hugging, but there's no cuddling. You know, that doesn't happen. Because I think that it just felt like the right thing to do in the session. And so I didn't have an internal prohibition against doing that. And it felt, you know, I was the co-therapist I was working with had a great deal of meditation experience, and was a meditation teacher, and she worked with, you know, like labeling the anxiety, saying hello to the anxiety, visualizing the anxiety. And this is the person that we talked about before. And we did that for about 15 minutes, and then afterwards I said, let me try this. And so I got on the couch with her, and I put my arm around her, and then she put her head on my shoulder and started sobbing. And so that just felt like the right thing to do. And that's nothing that I would do in a regular therapy session. But some of those boundaries are shifted a little bit in the way that we do therapy. And it certainly felt like the right thing to do. And that's the feedback that I got. I'm sure not everybody would handle it in that way.
Just curious, how are these experiments controlled? Do you have people go through the experience, but they don't get the psilocybin, but they still get the orientation and the therapy and the TLC and the debriefing? If they're not controlled at this phase of the research, what are the thoughts about controlling it in the next phase of the research?
Well, in this study, everybody got one dose of active drug and one dose of placebo. And so they had 2 dosing sessions, and they were separated by 7 weeks. So we had 3 preparatory sessions, a dosing session, 7 weeks with 3 integration or prep sessions, and then a second dosing session, and then 3 more. So people served as their own control, and at the end of the study, everybody was essentially the same. And the only difference is that some people waited an extra 7 weeks before having their active drug.
Could everyone tell which arm they were on?
You would think so, but actually not everyone. There are some people that had very low experiences on both, which was surprising.
Did anyone dissociate without the drug?
By that you mean did they have spiritual transformative experiences? Yes. I mean, it seems not inevitable, but it seems likely that a person with that kind of intention who prepares for it and then has like 7 hours on a couch listening to music with 2 therapists sitting next to them is just going to have an effect, and the experience of having therapists listen to your story, have you talk about your cancer, talk about it in a way that you've never talked about it with anybody before, it really changes people. So by the time they get to their first session, they're already prepared to be, doing this internal work in a different way than they were. We were shocked so often. People would come in and we would take a history, and then we would do this lifeline study where you put your birth here and your death here and your cancer somewhere here, and then you talk about what's happening here up to your cancer and then to the present and then what's in your future. And so many people would say, nobody has ever done that before. And I can't tell you what it has meant to me to look at my entire life, in this way. And so, to me, that's psychedelic therapy. That's preparing the meaning of life, to be narrating it, to be talking about it, to have it be held and understood by your therapist in a particular way. And then you have this psychedelic experience, which is, bubbling in that, that relationship. And then you talk about it afterwards with those 2 people who you've created this shared narrative.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you. I just kind of as an extension from what you're talking about right now, I wonder if we are approaching a time where an RCT is an inappropriate model or study design for certain types of treatment. In the context of shamanic healing, I think that a lot of the work of the shaman is also kind of provoking the body to heal itself as well. And in an RCT design, you're specifically controlling using a placebo to control for the body healing itself. And so I just wonder if you had any thoughts about that or kind of next steps as far as research and study design.
I'm not sure what you mean by a randomized clinical trial not involving the body healing itself.
I'm saying if you're using a placebo, then you are trying to control for the body healing itself, or the patient. I'm thinking about it in the context of a drug trial, right? You would have a placebo and then you would have the drug, and the placebo is specifically to control for any effects that the person's body is going to have towards healing in and of itself. So,
well, that's not really accurate. What the placebo does is it takes the expectation that the experience has, the relationship with the study, with the setting, with the people that are involved, and that is healing. That creates a certain kind of transformative process, and you have that exact same thing with the medicine and without it. So the idea is to ask what the medicine adds to that, but I don't want to stand here and defend the randomized clinical trial model as being one which brings psychedelic healing to its utmost effect. The purpose of our study is not first and foremost to heal patients. It is to generate data which will allow us to petition the FDA to accept a rescheduling process. So it's not that a randomized clinical trial sets itself as saying it's the best way to clinically treat patients. It's the best way to generate a certain kind of data to create a social process of rescheduling. I think that there's many things that we do in our study that are not necessarily ideal and offering the very best healing practice for the people that are working with us, but I like to say that the medicine shows up anyway, even though the conditions are not ideal or are not what would be best for that person. It seems like they're good enough. And the kind of the questions around placebo are really complicated with psychedelics, because if the person knows whether they're getting an active drug or placebo, then it's not a good placebo anymore, right? A placebo is required to be blind to the person who's taking it. And we have a lot of trouble in finding something that feels like psilocybin that isn't.
Thank you, Doctor. I was curious, if I understand you correctly, this is a synthesized form of psilocybin?
That's right.
And may I ask you, Doctor, how is it administered, and how is it that you came upon the optimum dose?
It's administered through a pill. In the first slide, I think I had a picture of a chalice with a pill in it. The dosage is 0.3 milligrams per kilogram, which was the dosage that we chose in order to bring the person with the greater likelihood of having a spiritual or mystical experience while staying shy of invoking a panic state. So it was a guess, and I think that our dosage was probably a little low and should be higher for next time. And I don't think that doing things on a milligram per kilogram basis is necessarily in all circumstances the best way to dose people. I think that there are intuitive approaches to that many people use that offer a different way to approach it. But this was industrial grade psilocybin that was made in an organic chemistry laboratory and given in a pill.
So thank you very much for this lecture. It's been really fascinating. And so I'm not a therapist. I teach meditation and mindfulness in clinical and therapeutic settings. And what I'm actually really curious about is what role you see, or what role do you see that meditation and mindfulness can play in the psychotherapeutic work with the psychedelics?
Well, mindfulness and meditation practice had several roles in the way that we conducted the study. We encouraged people to begin with a meditation practice in order to prepare for the self-reflective, self-observing process. We also taught them to a meditation breathing practice to regulate the intensity of the effect of the medicine if they felt they needed grounding or if they felt that they were becoming panicked. And during the integration sessions, we encouraged people to meditate, and we would give them the study music. They could listen to the soundtrack if they wanted to, in order to practice evoking this altered state of consciousness. We had quite an amazing, piece of feedback from somebody who was in a grocery store, and one of the songs from the soundtrack came on in this grocery store, and it brought him back into the state of mind that he'd had during the session. So this association was so deeply learned from just one hearing. And often we encourage people to meditate while listening to the music during follow-up sessions to learn how to evoke the state of mind that they found so useful.
Can I just
Sure.
So in a sense that, mindfulness and meditation, especially in the deeper states of meditation, they can have a very inherently psychotherapeutic benefit in terms of being able to track your difficult emotions.
Mhm.
And so when people are in the work that you're doing, are you bringing in mindfulness as a supplemental practice when the really dark and deeper emotions are starting to arise that might be very difficult to track otherwise?
Well, that's the core intervention that we have for them. We teach them a kind of abdominal breathing, during the preparatory sessions. Yeah. You're welcome.
Hi, thank you so
Hi.
much. You spoke a bit earlier to kind of the ways you'll overstep with respect to the history in the 60s and whatnot around protecting the boundary between clinician and participant in this case. And how in this case with this particular woman, you sat next to her and allowed her, put your arm around her and allowed her to lean on you, and how profound that was for her healing experience, and how that's not something you would do in your regular practice.
Mhm.
And at the beginning, you spoke to how you don't subscribe to the blank slate Freudian approach, more intersubjective, relational. And I guess I'm just curious, through this work, as you, or if you continue your practice outside of this, how have you been changed by seeing what has been healing in this practice, and how that is perhaps shifting even more how you view the way we maybe should be practicing non-psychedelic psychotherapy in our country today?
Wow. That's a big question. I would say that doing psychedelic therapy has led me to have greater trust in my empathy for patients, and a greater sense of trust that what I'm experiencing is part of a shared field, and not that it's some countertransference problem that's arising in me that I need to get rid of, but that this is all part of an energy field or a spirit field where we're receiving and sending information to each other. So I also use what comes into my imagination and body state changes that occur to me, and I trust them. I trust them more. So that's been an effect for me. Yeah.
What about the therapist also being on a maybe smaller dose? Would that be down the road be something that would be in trial?
Well, I was ready to give you a yes answer before you said the very last thing. I think that the idea of the therapist and the participant in the study both taking a psychedelic as part of a randomized clinical trial is something pretty far down the road. I can't imagine that that's ever going to really show up in my lifetime. It's difficult enough to introduce the idea that direct experience with psychedelics is beneficial, and that it doesn't impose a kind of loss of objectivity or just some kind of crazy, like we all want to get high reaction in randomized clinical trials. So I would have to say that doing psychedelic therapy, if you meditate, if you are present, you can enter the state, especially if you have some familiarity with it. So you're with them, and if you're empathic and are paying attention, and if you know them, I think you can enter a state with them. But in terms of it happening outside of randomized clinical trials, it makes a lot of sense to me, and I would be for it. We need a mic.
Hello.
Hi.
I graduated from CIIS about 10 years ago. I have a therapy degree. I've been a little disconnected with this wonderful community. But in these 10 years, I've been going back to my country of Colombia, where I've been training with shaman healers there. And it's something that I'm developing in my practice, but I keep them very separate because I'm fearful of losing my license. What do you know in terms of the law right now, and where do you think it's going as far as allowing practitioners like myself to bring both traditions together?
Well, I think there are probably people in this audience who can give you a more highly informed answer about the legal situation. But I don't think that you can administer ayahuasca outside of the context of the UDV or the Santo Daime in this country. So I think that the legal situation is quite restrictive, and offering ayahuasca medicine as part of a psychotherapy practice is strictly illegal. Yeah. I think it's only legal in the context of these protected religious sacrament settings.
Where do you see things going in the future? What is your opinion?
Which things in the future?
You know, allowing people to integrate psychotherapy and shamanism.
I can't even, I'd have to think about that question. Could I call upon the audience to give an answer? I think so much more about what psychotherapy needs to learn from shamanism rather than what shamanism needs to learn from psychotherapy. So, because what I do, I'm trying to learn and do better with what it is that I do, and I'm not a shaman. I'm not trained in that tradition. So I don't know how the information or the techniques or the methods or the theories would translate in the other direction. I do think though that shamanism seems like its own religious spiritual story that exists within its own culture, and I guess I'm curious as to what you think shamanism might want to take in from Western psychotherapy or psychoanalytic practice. Yeah, sure.
Well, what I see is that in the context where the shamans work in places where they practice the rainforest, the issues that people go for healing are very different to the kind of issues you see here. So for people living in this context, in this culture, psychotherapy is very helpful because that's why therapy was created, to deal with those issues. So when people go over there and get experience with the medicine with a traditional healer, they get a lot of insight, a lot of openings, but they don't necessarily deal with particular specific issues that they have developed because of living in this context, this culture. So there's a sense of there's something missing. So yes, I think there is something to be created by bringing traditions together for people that seek healing, that live in this culture.
Right. Well, I think before we can even talk about healing, we would need to talk about how we understand the malady. I think that in a shamanic culture, the core narrative for what's wrong, what's out of balance, is in quite a different language, quite a different vernacular than what we use in Western psychiatry. And we would need to find some way to bridge those two worlds and have them talk to one another and listen to one another. And I can imagine through certain kinds of psychoanalytic models how the sense of spirit possession or soul loss can be understood through projective identification and internalized object relations. I think that we could find language to talk about a similar process. Somebody's grieving for an ancestor, or somebody's haunted by a memory of an ancestor. You could talk about in these two different vernaculars and try to find a way to have them listen and talk to one another.
This question is about the future of the research. We hear a lot about the clinical trials happening with cancer patients, addiction, and PTSD. So what do you see as kind of the next set of diagnoses on the horizon, and also the future of research with well people, making well people better, including microdosing?
Well, I think you named the major hit parade of disorders. And again, I want to emphasize that in some ways the purpose of the research is to generate data which will allow for petitioning, which will allow for rescheduling. And so if that's your pragmatic goal, you want to have a disease that's undertreated or poorly treated in the first place, like PTSD, like addiction, like existential anxiety. Because if you already have problems that are well treated, or if you're trying to say we're going to treat people that are already well, the government is going to go like, we're not that interested in that. That sounds like a nice idea, but undertreated and poorly treated conditions, if we can show, like a significantly different outcome, that's noticeable. So in some ways, those are the reasons that those disorders are being chosen. There certainly is research going on at Hopkins, and in the past and in the present, with people who are long-term meditators, people who are not meditators, but are and have no psychedelic experience whatsoever. So there's certainly research going on with non-patient populations. Yeah.
So I'm trying to figure out how to ask this question, but can you characterize what you would say is your success rate, or how you see this trial in terms of your successes and failures?
I would say about 2/3 of the patients in our studies had remarkable transformations in their relationship to their cancer and their well-being in life. The stories from these individuals are inspiring and really strong. I think about 1/3 of the people in our study had a powerful experience, but it didn't seem to change them very much. And we also had some people who I think came into the study that really did not have cancer-related anxiety. They presented themselves as having it, but were actually there for other reasons, out of curiosity or out of a wish to get a certain kind of experience. And in general, we didn't see as profound an experience with them.
Could you speak to your exclusion criteria for the patients that you saw? Like, who did you feel like wasn't appropriate for the study, and if you included people with primary psychotic disorders or bipolar disorder or borderline personality disorder?
We didn't do an Axis 2 screening, and so there were some people with borderline personality disorder who were admitted, and they were among the people that I don't think had good responses, not because I think psychedelics are never appropriate for them, but I think that the structure of the therapy being about cancer was like really not right for them. And within the first session, we could see that the dynamics that you see with that kind of a patient started to emerge and were there all throughout the treatment. We didn't take anybody who had a primary psychotic disorder or bipolar disorder, and in fact, we didn't take people that had a first-degree relative with psychotic disorder. There was one person who was admitted to the study, but we ended after the first session because although she wasn't psychotic, she was paranoid. She had a paranoid disorder, and her entire worldview was filled with persecutory objects. And so we thought it'd be best to not keep her in the study for fear that would be exacerbated and be traumatizing rather than healing for her. But that was just a clinical guess. I mean, she might have gotten benefit from it. But if trust and rapport are important parts of the process going in, that's not what happened for her. So I think we're going to be stopping in just a couple of minutes, right? Oh, okay, another question.
I'm
curious what you would do differently in another study, kind of like this one. Like what do you see as maybe like mistakes, or what could be improved?
Well, I think that if people had had a chance to have 2, 3, or 4 sessions over a period of time, they would have gotten much more out of their experience. The fact that they had one session made it seem so freighted, and I think people could learn how to use the medicine that worked with it and get to know the therapist better. So that would be one thing that I think would really enhance the experience in the study. I also think that pre-recorded music is not such a great way to do it, although you'd have to make a case that it had no impact on or that having spontaneously chosen music or music that was created live wouldn't have a complicating research effect. So I don't think you'd ever get that one passed. But there are many things that I think were not optimal clinically for how I would like to treat a patient that were a central part, not a central part, but they were part of what had to happen. Okay. We have one more question.
Thank you. Hello, thank you. Will.
Hi.
Prior to ingesting the medicine, did you create any sort of ritual around the medicine itself with the patient, such as creating an intention for the journey or just a respect for where the medicine came from itself?
We did. With the people that I worked with, we had a long red velvet rope, and we would each state our intention and tie a knot in the rope and then tie the ends of it together. And that symbolized our being together for the entire day and held each of our intentions in a unit. And at the end of the day, we'd agreed at the beginning that we weren't going to leave until we untied it and spoke about our intentions again. So that was a ritual that the people that I worked with seemed to really, really like. Yeah, you're welcome.
Dr. Guss, thank you so much. Wonderful, wonderful talk. Really